She was 17 when she first rolled up her sleeve. The needle went in. Blood flowed out. Simple. Clean. Necessary. But Mary Richardson wasn't doing this for the Red Cross posters on the wall. She wasn't doing it for the nurses who smiled and offered her orange juice. She was doing it for a soldier she'd never met. A boy from Kansas bleeding out in a field hospital somewhere in France. The year was 1944. D-Day had come and gone. The beaches of Normandy had drunk deeply of American blood. And now, in a small donation center in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a teenage girl was determined to give back what had been lost. Drop by drop, week after week. They told her she could only donate once every 8 weeks. She didn't listen. She found other centers, used different names. Her mother's maiden name, her grandmother's first name. She mapped out a circuit through the city, hitting a different location each week. The nurses began to recognize her face, but they never said anything. They knew what desperation looked like. They saw it in every mother's eyes, every sister's tears, every sweetheart's trembling hands. Mary had 7 brothers, all of them overseas. Tommy in the Pacific, James with Patton's Third Army, Robert somewhere in Italy. Michael, Paul, and David scattered across Europe like seeds thrown to the wind. And little Johnny, barely 18, had just shipped out to join the 101st Airborne. 7 brothers. 7 chances to lose everything. The donation center on 5th Avenue became her church. The needle became her prayer. She memorized the weight of the blood bag filling beneath her arm. 1 pint. The amount that could save a life. The difference between a telegram that read wounded instead of killed in action. She kept a journal hidden beneath her mattress. Not of her daily life, but of every donation. The date, the time, the center. Which fake name she'd used. By the end of 1944, she'd filled 3 notebooks. The math was simple and terrifying. 4 years, once a week, 208 donations, 208 pints of blood, 26 gallons. Enough to fill a bathtub. Enough to save a platoon. The war had turned everyone into statisticians. Casualty rates, supply lines, blood types. Mary knew she was O negative. Universal donor. Her blood could save anyone, would save anyone, had to save someone, maybe even one of her brothers. She grew pale. Her mother noticed but said nothing. What was there to say? Everyone was sacrificing something. Food was rationed, metal was collected, sons were buried. And in Pittsburgh, a 17-year-old girl was slowly draining herself dry, 1 pint at a time, racing against a war that seemed to hunger for blood more than she could ever give. The letters came sporadically. Tommy wrote from a destroyer somewhere in the Pacific, his handwriting shaky from the constant roll of the waves. He talked about the heat, the endless blue horizon, the way the stars looked different in the southern hemisphere. He never mentioned the kamikaze attacks, never mentioned the bodies they pulled from the water after each battle. But Mary could read between the lines. She could feel the fear in the spaces between his words. James was different. His letters were short, almost angry. He wrote about the mud in France, the way it sucked at your boots, pulled you down, made every step a battle. He wrote about liberation, finding camps that defied description, horrors that made strong men weep. He wrote about needing more medical supplies, always more supplies. Never enough plasma, never enough blood. That's when Mary started going twice a week, Tuesday mornings at the center near the steel mills, Friday afternoons at the hospital downtown. She learned to eat steak the night before, even though meat was rationed. She stole iron supplements from the pharmacy where she worked part-time. She practiced walking steadily even when the world spun around her. The nurses started whispering they knew something was wrong. This girl who came too often, whose veins were beginning to scar, whose hands shook when she filled out the forms. But it was 1945 now, and the war was reaching its crescendo. The Battle of the Bulge had caught everyone off guard. Casualties were mounting. They needed every drop they could get. So they looked the other way. They pretended not to notice when Mary signed different names. They didn't question why a girl named Sarah one week was named Elizabeth the next. They just slid the needle in, watched the bag fill, and sent up their own prayers for whoever would receive this gift. Mary's mother found the journals on a February morning. She'd been changing the sheets when she felt the notebooks beneath the mattress. She sat on her daughter's bed and read every entry. 200 donations, and counting. Her daughter was giving away pieces of herself, literally bleeding for her brothers, for strangers, for a cause that demanded everything and promised nothing in return. That night, she confronted Mary. The conversation was quiet, held in the kitchen while snow fell outside. Mother and daughter, both exhausted by a war that had taken their men and was now taking their blood. Mary expected anger. Instead, her mother pulled up her own sleeve. There, on the inside of her arm, were needle marks. Dozens of them. "I've been going too," her mother whispered. "Different centers than you. I figured it out months ago." They held each other then, two women bound by love and fear and the terrible arithmetic of war. How much blood could they give? How much was enough? How much before there was nothing left? They made a pact that night. They would go together. They would watch each other. They would make sure neither gave too much, but they would not stop, not while their boys were still out there. Not while strangers' sons were bleeding in foxholes and field hospitals. Not while there was still blood in their veins and war in the world. Spring came late to Pittsburgh in 1945. The steel mills continued their endless production, sending smoke into skies that couldn't decide between winter and renewal. Mary turned 18 in March, but there was no celebration. Johnny had been wounded during Operation Varsity, the massive airborne assault across the Rhine. The telegram said he was stable. It didn't say he'd lost his left leg below the knee. Mary doubled her donations. She found centers in neighboring towns, borrowed her friend's car, drove until she found places where they didn't know her face. She became an expert at lying. Different names, different addresses, different stories. She was donating for her church. She was part of a women's auxiliary group. She was fulfilling a pledge. Anything to get them to take her blood. The effects were becoming harder to hide. She fainted at work, crashing into a display of cough syrup. Her supervisor sent her home, told her to rest, to eat more. But how could she rest? How could she eat when her brothers were starving in POW camps or bleeding in field hospitals? She'd received one letter from Robert. He'd been captured in Italy, spent months in a German stalag. He wrote about men dying from infected wounds that simple plasma could have prevented. Men whose blood types matched hers. Her mother tried to intervene. She hid Mary's donation journal. She put locks on the car. She even called the donation centers, warning them about her daughter. But Mary was 18 now. Legal, determined. She walked to the centers when she had to. She hitchhiked. She did whatever it took to get there, to roll up her sleeve, to give what she could. The science of blood donation in 1945 was crude compared to what would come later. They didn't fully understand the effects of chronic blood loss. They didn't monitor iron levels or hemoglobin counts. They just knew they needed blood, and there were people willing to give it. People like Mary, who had turned her body into a factory of sacrifice, producing pints of hope for strangers across an ocean. By April, she'd logged her 300th donation. 300 times she'd felt the needle pierce her skin. 300 times she'd watched her blood flow into bags destined for cargo planes and hospital ships. 300 acts of faith that somewhere, somehow, her gift would find its purpose. She started dreaming about blood. Rivers of it flowing across Europe. Oceans of it in the Pacific. She dreamed of her brothers swimming in red seas, calling out for more, always more. She woke with her heart racing, her sheets soaked with sweat, her arms aching where the needles had left their marks. But still, she went back, every week, sometimes more. The news from Europe was improving. The Allies were pushing deeper into Germany. The end was in sight, they said. But Mary had learned not to trust such promises. The war in the Pacific still raged. Men were still dying. And she still had blood to give. So she gave it, pint by pint, prayer by prayer, until her body was more determination than flesh, more will than blood. May 8, 1945. V-Day. Victory in Europe. The streets of Pittsburgh erupted in celebration. Church bells rang. People danced. Strangers kissed strangers. The war was over, half over anyway. Mary stood at her bedroom window, watching the revelry below, counting on her fingers. 4 brothers in Europe. Safe now. Maybe. 3 in the Pacific. Still fighting. Still bleeding. She went to donate that very afternoon. The center was nearly empty. Everyone else was celebrating. The nurse looked at her with concern. "Honey, you can go home. The war in Europe is over." Mary just rolled up her sleeve. "Not all of it," she said. The nurse nodded, understanding. She had a son on Okinawa. The donations became a meditation. The ritual of it, the forms, the questions. Any illness? No. Any medications? No. Have you donated recently? No. Always no. She'd memorized the timing between centers, knew exactly how long to wait before returning to each one. She'd become a ghost in the system, a phantom donor existing in the gaps between record-keeping. Her body was betraying her in new ways now. Her hair was falling out in clumps. Her fingernails had stopped growing. Her periods had stopped entirely, her body conserving every resource for survival. But she'd received word that Tommy's ship had been hit by a kamikaze. He'd survived, but barely. Burns covered 40% of his body. He needed transfusions, constant transfusions, so Mary gave more. She found a center that operated at night, catering to factory workers. She went there after her day shifts, then hit another center on weekends. 400 donations now. The number seemed impossible, but her journals didn't lie. Each entry meticulously recorded. Date, time, location, amount. A ledger of love written in her own blood. Her mother had stopped trying to stop her. Instead, she cooked iron-rich meals, liver and onions, spinach, black-eyed peas. She forced Mary to eat, sitting across from her at the kitchen table, making sure every bite was swallowed. They didn't speak during these meals. What was there to say? They both understood the mathematics of sacrifice. They both knew the price of love in wartime. June brought heat and bad news. Michael had been wounded on Luzon, shrapnel to the chest. Critical condition. Mary added another donation site to her circuit. She was up to 3 per week now, sometimes 4. The nurses at each center thought she was a once-a-month donor, a good citizen doing her part. They didn't know she was systematically draining herself, turning her veins into pipelines of hope. She kept Michael's last letter in her pocket. He'd written about the Philippines, about children begging for chocolate, about the strange beauty of jungle birds. He'd written about missing home, missing her terrible cooking, missing the way she used to steal his baseball cards. Normal brother things, human things, things worth bleeding for. By the 4th of July, Mary could no longer climb stairs without stopping to rest. She hid it well, had become expert at concealing weakness. She wore long sleeves even in summer heat, hiding the track marks of her obsession. She smiled when people asked about her brothers. Yes, they were doing well. Yes, she was proud. Yes, the war would be over soon. Lies came as easily as blood now. Both flowed from her without resistance. August arrived with unbearable heat and impossible news. The atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima, then Nagasaki. The war was ending, they said. Japan would surrender. The killing would stop. Mary didn't believe it. Couldn't believe it. Not until every one of her brothers was home, not until the bleeding stopped. Hers and theirs. She was at 450 donations now. The number staggered even her. 450 pints, 56 gallons. More blood than 3 human bodies contained. She'd given away multiples of herself, parceled out her life force in measured doses, and still, it wasn't enough. Would never be enough. The donation center on Carson Street had a new nurse, young, fresh from training, full of rules and regulations. She looked at Mary's arms and frowned. "These scars," she said. "How often have you been donating?" Mary lied smoothly, but the nurse wasn't convinced. She checked the records, found discrepancies, names that didn't match, dates that didn't add up. They barred her from that center, put her name on a list. Mary didn't care. There were other centers. Always other centers. She just had to travel farther. Ohio wasn't that far. West Virginia was just across the border. She mapped out new routes, new identities, new lies. The infrastructure of her obsession grew more complex, but her purpose remained simple. Give blood, save lives, bring them home. Her mother found her collapsed in the garden on August 14th. The tomatoes needed picking, and Mary had insisted on doing it herself. She'd made it halfway down the first row before the world went dark. She woke in the hospital, IV lines feeding someone else's blood back into her body. The irony wasn't lost on her. The doctor was kind but firm. Her hemoglobin was critically low. Her iron stores were depleted. Her body was eating itself, consuming muscle and organ tissue to produce red blood cells. She was dying, he said. Slowly but surely dying. She needed to stop. Immediately. Completely. Mary laughed. Actually laughed. Stop? When Paul was still in a field hospital in the Philippines? When David's letter spoke of preparing for the invasion of Japan? When men she'd never met were bleeding out on islands she couldn't pronounce? Stop was not a word in her vocabulary, not anymore. They kept her for 3 days, pumped her full of iron and vitamins and lectures about self-care. She nodded and smiled and made promises she had no intention of keeping. On the 3rd night she slipped out, walked the 6 miles home in her hospital gown. Her mother found her the next morning, dressed and ready to go to the donation center. "The war is ending," her mother pleaded. Truman announced it. "Japan is discussing surrender terms." "It's over, Mary. It's over." But Mary shook her head. Over was a word for politicians and newspapers. Over was for people who hadn't sent 7 brothers to war. Over was for people who still had all their blood. She had a new plan now. The centers in Pennsylvania knew her. Word had spread. But New York was just a train ride away. Philadelphia had dozens of centers. She'd saved money from her job. She could travel. She could continue. She had to continue. The math was simple. She'd given 450 pints. She could give 50 more, and even 500, a number that meant something, a number worth dying for. August 15, 1945. VJ Day. The war was over, truly over this time. Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over radios across America, admitting defeat. In Pittsburgh, the celebrations dwarfed those of VE Day. Confetti fell like snow, car horns blared in jubilant cacophony. The steel mills whistled victory through their smokestacks. Mary Richardson sat in a donation center in Youngstown, Ohio, watching her 470th pint flow into a bag. The nurse didn't know why the young woman was crying. Tears of joy, she assumed. Everyone was crying today. The war was over. The boys were coming home. But Mary's tears were more complex. Relief, yes, but also fear. What was she without this purpose? Who was she if not the girl who bled for others? The next weeks brought a strange kind of limbo. The war was over, but men were still dying. Occupation forces still needed blood. Hospitals in Manila and Tokyo still required plasma. The machinery of mercy couldn't simply stop because politicians had signed papers. Mary used this logic to justify her continued donations. 475, 480, 485. Letters began arriving with increasing frequency. Tommy was being shipped home. The burns would require years of treatment, but he was alive. Coming home. James wrote from Germany, where he was helping process displaced persons. The stories he told were horrific, but his handwriting was steady. He'd survived. They all had, miraculously, 7 brothers sent to war. 7 brothers coming home. The odds were impossible, yet here they were. Mary's mother tried to celebrate, but she watched her daughter with growing alarm. Mary had always been thin, but now she was skeletal. Her skin had a grayish pallor that makeup couldn't hide. She moved like an old woman, careful and slow, conserving energy for her twice-weekly pilgrimages to whatever donation center would have her. The first brother to return was Robert. He came home in September, still gaunt from his time in the POW camp, but alive. Gloriously alive. He hugged Mary at the train station and immediately pulled back, alarmed. "Jesus, Mary, you feel like a bird." "What happened to you?" She laughed it off. The war had been hard on everyone. Rationing, worry, the usual lies. But Robert had survived by reading people, by knowing when someone was hiding something. He watched his sister carefully, noticed how she struggled to carry a simple grocery bag, how she gripped the stair railing like a lifeline, how she excused herself from Sunday dinner to run errands that always took exactly 2 hours, the time it took to get to a donation center and back. He followed her one Tuesday, watched her enter a blood donation center in Aliquippa, a town 30 miles from home. Watched her sign in with a name that wasn't hers. Watched her roll up her sleeve to reveal arms so scarred they looked like maps of railway lines. He wanted to storm in, to stop her, but something held him back. A recognition, perhaps. He'd fought his war with a rifle. She'd fought hers with a needle. Who was he to say which sacrifice was greater? Instead, he waited, confronted her that night when she returned home, weak and shaking. The family meeting that followed was explosive. 7 brothers, all home or heading home, learning what their sister had done. 490 donations and counting. The number silenced them, made them count their own scars, their own sacrifices, and find them somehow smaller. October 1945 brought all the brothers home except Johnny, who was learning to walk on a prosthetic at Walter Reed. The house was full again, loud with male voices, thick with cigarette smoke, alive with the energy of survival. Mary moved through it all like a ghost, smiling at their stories, laughing at their jokes, sneaking out when she could to add to her total. 495, 496, 497. She was so close now, so close to 500. The number had taken on mystical significance. 500 pints, 500 gifts, 500 chances she'd given for other sisters to see their brothers again. It seemed important to reach it, essential, as if stopping at 499 would negate everything that came before. Her brother staged interventions. Tommy, still wrapped in bandages, told her about the blood transfusions that saved his life, how grateful he was to unknown donors, how he didn't want his sister to be one of them, not like this, not at this cost. James spoke of the camps he'd liberated, how the survivors had taught him that living was its own form of resistance, that she needed to live now, for them. But they didn't understand. How could they? They'd had clear enemies, Nazis, Japanese soldiers, things to shoot at. Her enemy had been helplessness, the terrible arithmetic of war that said some would die and some would live, and there was nothing a teenage girl in Pittsburgh could do about it, except there was. She'd found a way, and she couldn't stop now, not when she was so close. Her health was deteriorating rapidly. She'd started having heart palpitations. Her vision would gray out at the edges when she stood too quickly. She'd developed a tremor in her hands that made it hard to hold a pen. Her mother begged. Her brothers threatened. Even Johnny wrote from the hospital telling her to stop, that she'd done enough, more than enough. But the donation centers were still open. The blood drives continued. The Red Cross posters still proclaimed the need. And men were still dying in occupation hospitals, in rehabilitation wards, from infected wounds and surgical complications. The war was over, but its aftermath stretched on, demanding its own sacrifices. She made it to 499 in early November, the donation center in Erie, Pennsylvania, where no one knew her face or her story. The nurse was efficient, professional, didn't notice the way Mary's hands shook as she filled out the forms, didn't see the notebook where she recorded this penultimate number, didn't understand she was witnessing the end of an obsession that had consumed 4 years and nearly 500 pints. That night, Mary collapsed at dinner. Her body, pushed beyond all reasonable limits, finally rebelled. Her heart, struggling to pump what little blood remained, stuttered and stopped. For 30 seconds, long enough for her brothers to panic, long enough for her mother to scream, long enough for Mary to see a darkness deeper than any she'd known. They kept her in the hospital for 2 weeks. This time, she was too weak to escape, too weak to protest. The doctors ran tests, took x-rays, shook their heads at the results. Severe anemia, cardiac damage, organ stress. She'd given so much blood that her body had begun consuming itself, breaking down muscle tissue to create red blood cells. She was 19 years old with the body of someone 3 times that age. Recovery was its own kind of war. November turned to December and Mary remained hospitalized. Her brothers took turns sitting with her, telling stories of the war, trying to fill the silence with words. But she wasn't interested in their battles. She wanted to know about the blood, the transfusions they'd seen, the lives saved, the difference it made. Tommy understood first. He pulled up a chair one snowy afternoon and told her the truth. About the medic who'd held IV bags above his head for 6 hours straight during the kamikaze attack. About the boy from Tennessee who'd died when they ran out of plasma. About the Filipino nurse who'd given her own blood directly, vein to vein, to save an American soldier she'd never met. He understood sacrifice. He understood why she'd done it. The others followed, each brother bringing stories of blood and salvation. James talked about finding a field hospital in France where nuns had bled themselves nearly dry to save American paratroopers. Robert described Italian partisans who'd raided German medical supplies, desperate for plasma. Michael spoke of Filipino civilians who'd formed human chains to carry wounded Americans to aid stations, knowing that blood, any blood, might make the difference. They were trying to tell her she wasn't alone, that her sacrifice was part of something larger. A web of blood that had stretched across the world, connecting strangers in the most intimate way possible. Life flowing from one to another. The universal donor meeting the universal need. On December 15th, they brought Johnny home. He walked into her hospital room on his prosthetic leg, steady and strong. He didn't speak at first, just sat on her bed and pulled out a small box. Inside was a medal, not his, not military, something he'd had made at a jewelry shop in Washington. A small silver heart with 500 engraved on it. I talked to the nurses, he said quietly, at all the centers. Took some doing, but I tracked down most of your donations. 499 confirmed. He placed the medal in her palm. This is for the 500th, the one you're not going to give, the one you're going to keep, for us. Mary held the medal and wept. For the first time since she'd started donating, she truly wept, not from pain or exhaustion or fear, but from recognition. She'd fought her war. She'd given what she could, and it was enough. It had to be enough. The doctors said she'd need months to recover, maybe years. The damage was extensive but not irreversible. With proper nutrition, rest, and care, she could rebuild what she'd given away. Her brothers made it their mission. They cooked, they cleaned, they carried her when she was too weak to walk. They gave back what she'd given out. By Christmas, she was home. Weak still, but home. The house was decorated, the tree lit, the kitchen full of the smells of her mother's cooking. Her brothers were all there, all 7, alive and whole enough. The arithmetic of war had somehow worked in their favor. 7 out, 7 back. Plus one sister who'd bled herself nearly dry, ensuring other families might say the same. January 1946 arrived with snow and new beginnings. Mary was stronger now, able to walk short distances, to eat full meals, to sleep without dreams of flowing blood. Her brothers had settled into civilian life with varying degrees of success. Tommy was in and out of hospitals for his burns. James had nightmares. Robert jumped at loud noises. But they were home. They were healing. They were alive. The donation centers called occasionally, wondering where their regular donor had gone. Mary's mother intercepted these calls, politely but firmly explaining that Miss Richardson, or Mitchell or Johnson or whatever name they had, would not be returning. Ever. The war was over. Her war was over. But habits die hard. Mary still felt the pull every Tuesday and Friday, still calculated how long it had been since her last donation, still felt guilty when she passed Red Cross posters. The need was still there, would always be there. People still required blood. Accidents still happened. Surgeries still demanded transfusions. The machinery of medical need ground on, war or no war. Her brothers understood. They'd started donating themselves. Not obsessively, not dangerously, but regularly. They made it a family affair. Once every 2 months, all 7 would go together. A platoon of donors, they joked, continuing the mission their sister had started. They kept her company on these trips, making sure she stayed in the waiting room, making sure she understood that her bleeding days were done. Spring brought stronger health and difficult questions. What now? She was 20 years old, had spent 4 crucial years focused entirely on one purpose. She had no education beyond high school, no skills beyond those learned at donation centers, no identity beyond being the girl who gave blood. The future stretched before her, blank and terrifying. It was Tommy who suggested nursing school. He'd spent enough time in hospitals to know good nurses from bad. Mary, he said, had the dedication, the understanding of sacrifice, the willingness to bleed, metaphorically now for others. The other brothers agreed, pooled their GI benefits, made it happen. By September, Mary was enrolled at the University of Pittsburgh School of Nursing. She excelled, of course. Anatomy was easy when you'd spent 4 years studying your own circulatory system. Pharmacology made sense when you understood blood loss intimately. Patient care came naturally to someone who'd spent years putting others' needs before her own. Her professors noted her dedication, her attention to detail, her unusual empathy for trauma patients. She graduated in 1949, second in her class. Her brothers all attended the ceremony, Johnny standing tall on his prosthetic, Tommy's scars hidden beneath his dress uniform. They watched their sister receive her nursing pin, watched her take the Nightingale Pledge, watched her commit professionally to what she'd already proven personally, that she would devote her life to those who needed healing. But she kept the medal Johnny had given her, wore it on a chain beneath her uniform, a reminder of the 500th pint, the one she'd kept, the one that let her live to give in other ways, the one that taught her that sometimes the greatest sacrifice is knowing when to stop. 50 years later, Mary Richardson sat in a different kind of donation center, the blood bank at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, where she'd worked for 3 decades before retiring. She was 70 now, silver-haired and dignified, watching a new generation of donors roll up their sleeves. The technology had changed. The bags were plastic now, not glass. The screening was computerized, the records were digital, but the essence remained the same. Life flowing from one stranger to another. She was there for a ceremony. The hospital was honoring longtime donors, those who'd given gallons over years of safe, regulated donations. She wasn't being honored. Her donations had been too long ago, too scattered, too dangerous to celebrate officially. But they'd asked her to speak. Someone had heard her story. 499 donations during World War II, a legend whispered among the older nurses. The girl who'd nearly bled herself to death for others. The speech she gave was short. She talked about her brothers, all 7 still alive, miraculously. Old men now, gathered in the audience, some in wheelchairs, all wearing their veteran caps. She talked about the mathematics of war, how blood given in Pittsburgh could save a life in Normandy, how sacrifice compounded, how love multiplied. She didn't glamorize what she'd done. Spoke honestly about the damage, the years of recovery, the heart problems that still plagued her, the kidney issues from prolonged anemia, the way her body had never fully forgiven her for what she'd put it through. She'd survived, yes, but survival came with costs. Everything did. But she also talked about the letters. Hundreds of them received over the years, from soldiers who'd learned somehow about the girl who'd donated every week for 4 years, from nurses who'd administered her blood, from families who'd gotten their boys back because plasma had been available. She'd kept them all. Proof that the arithmetic had worked, that the sacrifice had mattered. She ended with a challenge, not to do what she'd done. That was madness, she admitted, but to give what they could, safely, regularly, sustainably. To understand that blood was the most intimate gift one stranger could give another, that every pint contained the possibility of reunion, of another day, of another chance. After the ceremony, a young woman approached her, a new donor, nervous about her first time. She'd heard Mary's speech, wanted to know more. Mary sat with her, held her hand as the needle went in, watched the bag fill. Remembered her own first time, 17 years old, terrified, determined, giving the only thing she had to give. The woman asked her if she regretted it, nearly killing herself, giving so much that it had damaged her permanently. Mary thought for a long moment, looked at her brothers, aged and alive, thought of all the brothers who'd made it home because blood had been there when needed, thought of the 500th pint, the one she'd kept, the one that let her become a nurse, a wife, a mother, a grandmother. "I regret not being able to give the 500th, she said finally, "but I'm glad I kept it. It taught me something important, that sometimes the greatest gift isn't what you give away, it's what you save, what you preserve, what you keep so you can keep giving in other ways." The blood bank was closing, the donors were leaving, but Mary stayed a moment longer, watching the refrigerated units hum with their precious cargo. Thousands of pints, millions over the years, an ocean of generosity, a mathematics of hope that continued long after the wars ended. She touched the medal at her throat, 499, plus all the lives she'd touched as a nurse, plus all the donations her story had inspired. The arithmetic of sacrifice, still calculating, still compounding, still flowing from one heart to another, forever and always, until the bleeding stopped, until everyone made it home. Please don't let their sacrifices be forgotten. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your own family's stories of wartime sacrifice in the comments below. This channel exists to honor those who gave everything and those who nearly did. Your support helps us continue telling these untold stories of courage, one video